I have been making RPG Maker related sprites for close to 11 to 12 years now. I've come a long way from then when I started, and I haven't slowed down too much yet. A friend asked me one time online, Leo, what was it that got you into RPG making and RPG Maker sprites? I remember when you used to do sprite works on DeviantArt back then, and your cool little character concepts. What got you into RPG making sprite works? Well, that's very simple, my friend. It was the original RPG Maker, or RPG Maker 1 on PS1 or PlayStation back then in the late 1990s and 2000s. That was when it all came to fruition for me, thanks to my older sister Cassandra and my other sister Ebony. I remember fondly watching her play RPG Maker 1 back at one of my dad's old houses, and I just sat there watching her play this RPG Maker 1 game, and I'm like, you can make your own RPG Maker game with this thing? Because I remember one of the areas she was playtesting, she was going through a sewer area, a sewer dungeon, and then later she had to fight this boss to get out, going, if you want to pass through here, you must defeat me. And it was interesting. What kind of game was it that she was making? I have no idea, but the concept and design and idea behind this was amazing and alluring. The fact you could make your own RPG Maker game was something I had never heard of or even thought of back then. She also let me playtest the demo that came with RPG Maker 1, and that was Gobbly, a story about a goblin who aimed to be his own boss because he was tired of being the weakest enemy in the game, because goblins were considered the most weakest enemies in RPG Maker games, or RPG games in general, next to slimes. And it was charming in its own way. It was really cute. The game design and characters were like old school RPG games with the first person view battle system and everything, but we never really got far into the game, sadly. But it was charming in its own way, and I liked the simple first-person battle system. The concept of making my own RPG Maker game was something I never thought would work or fly with my imagination back then, because, as you know, I have attention deficit disorder. But deep in my subconscious, the ideas were coming together and stirring together like a fine pot of beef stew or soup. After time passed, especially after high school, one of my other sisters, Ebony, had the game herself, and she was thinking of her own fantasy concepts and everything. One where the characters were fighting in a war and they go across this bridge to fight the general. One where the main characters go inside this house, they fight demons, and they gain the house, sort of like Suikoden back then. And where the Suikoden characters find an island, they fight the monsters, and they gain control of the base. I even tried out making a game for myself, and I came up with simple ideas ranging from a samurai coming home after a long gruesome war to his family and loved ones, to a knight and his crusaders of justice trying to stop an evil warlock or warlord. The ideas were there, but the whole process and foundation was unstable, like a Jenga block tower getting ready to fall down. After a while, my other sister left, and the game went with her too. So I was left with no way to really output my ideas for stories or the concepts I had in my head. There was no way for me to put them out. So after a while, I just gave up on writing stories and everything, and I just put them away inside my subconscious for a while. But it wasn't until I got my new computer back then in the mid-2009-2010 era, my first Acer Vista Tower, that I tried to write down my ideas and characters and stories so that way I would never forget them. Back then, I had a couple of influences that would, motivate me into writing a bit, especially because of late nights with watching Toonami, of all things, or other anime that would entice my interest or pique my interest. And those influences range from Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy, Samurai Deeper Kyo, Naruto of all things, Knights of the Round, and even Phantasy Star, to name a few. Even though technically I never beat a single Phantasy Star game, and I only really played through Phantasy Star 4 and made it halfway through the game, and I've only played a little bit of Phantasy Star Online, so yeah, there was that. So there I was, just a dreamer with many story ideas and concepts running through his head back in the late 2010s, especially after losing my job back then due to cutbacks, and then, of course, afterwards losing my uncle figure slash boss man to a form of cancer, and then losing the other boss man a few years later due to natural causes. When I started typing out my story ideas on the computer, I did my best to develop looks, designs, concepts, and overall plots. However, I was still running off old childhood memories from watching my sister play Final Fantasy, or Star Ocean, or watching anime on Toonami, or even from what little books I read, and I'm not really a heavy reader due to my attention deficit disorder, which sucks. Other concepts include Knights of the Round, the arcade game, King Arthur, and the Knights of Justice, and Double Dragon, the cartoon series of all things. Who remembers that cartoon? King Arthur and the Knights of Justice? Holy crap. There's a throwback for you. I think one of the first concepts I came up with back then was I was going to make a group of ninjas like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and a bit of Naruto inspiration go on a crusade to stop an ancient demon that had become unsealed after a freak accident. Also in the story and concept, one of the ninjas would have two sides to their personality, a yin and a yang, but the idea never really worked out despite how good it seemed, because even my cousin and a pal of his said it would not work out. Heck, my main character's name at that time was Sage, and that's a girl's name of all things. That was pretty stupid looking at it. Sage? After looking at it now, the game was never going to work as it was a unisex name and more suited for girls. Maybe one day I'll think of a way how to make a character named Sage correctly? But yeah, after a while I started calling my character Sage Murayami, and that wasn't really gonna work. If it was Cage, then I'd be copying off a Virtua Fighter of all things. But it wasn't until 2011 and 2012 that I discovered RPG Maker VX and RPG Maker 2003 that my concepts and ideas and plots came back in full swing motion, and I could finally get my mojo flowing and finally make a story and perhaps a game come true of all things. I rushed into this pretty quickly. I downloaded the program, read up on guides for it, and started my new journey of making a story. But little did I know that the journey to making a story, let alone an RPG game, will be full of tons of hurdles, pitfalls, and even difficulties. I found the interface for the program simple and easy to get into, and the map making was as simple as drawing your map with the mouse of all things like Mario Paint. Map making was easy to use, and placing the items like trees, rocks, bushes, and other things was simple to do, but sadly, as I said before, making maps was never really my cup of tea. Even in RPG Maker 1 on the PlayStation, I could never make them look right. Stuff would overlap each other, and certain objects would pass through things, and it would just seem blocky. So yeah, I can never make the maps look right. So yeah, the character sprites I actually made on this Flash site were pretty decent, but I was limited because I didn't have things like GIMP or later Game Character Hub, but we'll get back to that later. The sprite generators were limited with how you could make certain characters look, from the clothes to the accessories and the hair. Didn't have many choices back then. Some parts overlaid the body, making it look really weird or bad looking. But after a while, I worked with what I had, you know? Work with what you got. And I continued work with Project Sage back then, and that was fine, you know? Anyone remember Project Sage, for that matter? I'm pretty sure some of you remember from when I first started on RPG Maker back then in the old days. And if you do, thank you. If for those of you who don't know, Project Sage was the brainchild of my mind and concepts from wanting to write my own story. Sage Murayami was the name of the main character, but looking at it now was a dumb name. So yeah, He started as a ninja, then he became a samurai swordsman, of all things. I managed to get many resources to help me with making the game and everything, and the story, ranging from backgrounds to music and even battle monster pictures. I found resources off of this Final Fantasy Sprite website, as well as other Sprite resource websites, and I wanted to use those and replace some of the animations and monster designs that they had with RPG Maker VX, and surprisingly, they actually looked good. I even found some battle maps of all things from backgroundhq.com of all things, but I think I had more fun making a soundtrack for my characters than I did actually making a story of all things, so yeah. But trying to make the monsters and bosses stable and balanced was still a grueling task. I did multiple playtests with the monsters, and going through the maps trying to get the dialogue boxes to work right, especially full dialogue when the characters are thinking or when they talk with other characters or NPCs. And trying to get certain events to happen were always a hassle, like you want this to trigger this for later on when you go into this area. That was always a hassle. But when they worked right, I was pleasantly happy with the results. Seriously, very, very happy with the results. For the most part, the RPG Maker game was a simple one. You put together your own role-playing game from the many resources that were included in it. You might be limited with the little pictures, sprites, and music and maps included, but it's all there for you to use for your own discretion. You'd have to staple together map pictures just to make your own maps, and how the characters traverse the map basically from point A to point B and so on, and how they enter for the most part. But putting things together, like your own characters and their stats, was your responsibility. You had to make the characters and choose what they look like and what their warrior class would be, and then make them as strong as you could think of to be. That was always one of my downsides to playing the game, trying to put up the stats of the characters. Then, of course, making up the maps and towns. You had to make up scenarios and what characters or NPCs would say. That was challenging, but it was fun to do. Once that was all done, you would have to come up with the monsters and bosses that they would fight. Trying to come up with the stats and strength of the monster, that was always a challenge, and it gave me a headache, because I wanted them to be strong but not too strong, and not OP or spam the same attack over and over and over again. So yeah. And making cutscenes or story events was no better. It was always so difficult. The first RPG Maker game was simple, but still tough to do, because you gotta make it so certain events will do this and trigger this. It was always a tedious task. The music in the game was pretty simple enough, and the sounds were okay as they were. The whole thing was like a toy or a toy box. You could pull something unique out of the toy box and put it together like you were playing with Lego blocks and see how it all plays out. And once you were finished with it, you'd play test it, see how it plays out, and if something wasn't right, you would go back and edit that process just to see if it would play through again. Sadly, however, the only person who would be able to play that finished RPG game you made would be only you, unless someone else had the game and software and a memory card, sadly. I would go on about the rest, but I don't want to bore you with too much of the rest of the details. If you already have RPG makers of your own that you like to play around with. So yeah. The concept and ideas were there, and I was doing my best to put everything together, you know. I would focus on making the start of the game or story to be a nice little demo where the character goes into a forest to train his skills and fight some of the monsters. Then he runs into a girl who is sort of like a ninja fighter. They end up teaming up together to fight against these bandits, and then the bandits run away. The girl would join him in his journey, and that was all I really had at that time. I remember trying to put out a demo for it, but I only got as far as making the cabin, little areas of the forest, a few monsters, and the dialogue, and that was it. That was pretty much it. I really sucked when it came to doing that sort of thing, so yeah. I only really got as far as making the cabin, the forest, and a decent amount of a town because of the auto generator. The town was even more troublesome as I was unsure of how I wanted it to look, and I was limited with the tile set in RPG Maker VX. But more than anything, I needed to work on the story more than anything. What was the story going to be for these characters? And the foundation was not sustainable or stable. Like a Jenga tower, it was doomed to fall. So I decided to focus more on the characters, the items and the armor and the weapons and the monsters and events. I made little scenarios here and there by making demo maps, and I was gathering my bearings for future ideas. But sadly, all good things must come to an end, and I lost the motivation to continue the project back in 2014. After a while of trying again and again to get back into the motions, I decided to just quit the project, and I put it in a zip file for safekeeping. And I also abandoned the project due to not getting help on the game's scripts and events. I was supposed to get help from 2 users who promised to help me, but then they completely brushed me off! And I was like, some friends you guys turned out to be, screw you! I didn't really want to delete everything that I had worked on at that time, so I just decided to come back to it one day when I had the time, the patience, and better understanding of how to make the game, and the scripting and everything, because back then I did not want to work with the front view style first-person battle system. I wanted to do side battle system. I wanted to do a front view side battle like Final Fantasy or a typical RPG flair, and I had to script for it, but try to put everything together and make certain bosses do that little, special death animation was not easy. Not to mention, trying to make it so only the individual sprites would appear on screen and not a whole jumbled amount of sprites. That was never easy. Even if it was just a limited progress, I felt like I could do anything. And it was a rough decision for me to leave the project the way I did, but maybe it was for the best. I needed to focus on more important things, like the story and the characters and the concept and the world that they would be living in and everything. But what came from working with the sprite generators online came something unique and interesting. All of a sudden, the cogs in my head just started turning, and I started making more character sprites on the generators, and after a while, I discovered I had a talent for making RPG Maker character sprites. Sadly, I was still limited with what work I could do, and my sprites were not spectacular as they were back then. I kept using the sprite generators for a while, and amazingly, I got a little fanfare from people on DeviantArt when I started posting up my sprite works. The sprite works ranged from original characters from cartoons, anime, TV, even comic books of all things, and video games. And yeah, that was really cool. And I kept going, that is, until the Jake Jackson Mystic Quest Remastered incident, where a user by the name of Jake Jackson made what was considered a lovely remake or remastered version of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest back then. And it was all made using RPG Maker VX Ace style graphics and design. He would have, just like the game was, in a sense, the 2 characters battling against the enemies, casting spells, and doing all sorts of stuff like Mystic Quest was back then. He originally used my sprites in the remake, in RPG Maker VX, and although I was a bit angry back then at him for doing so, I reached out and contacted him and told him that, hey, using my sprites, dude, what the heck? And I googled it, and I'm like, crap, my sprite works are appearing on Google. He apologized, and he said if I ever made another batch of sprites, he would love to make them in the updated version he was working on. And I said, okay, but sure, no problem. As time went by, I continued to look at the project, and I saw the many updates it had. I even watched one of my YouTuber pals named Gun Arm Dime play one of the latest builds, and it was spectacular and quite a thrill. I wanted to play the game myself and see my sprites in glorious moving action, because it was like, my sprites are finally being used for something. It's no longer just fan art or concept art or anything. It was so wonderful. It really brought a tear to my eyes. But by the time I was going to download it, the website was gone. At first I thought Jake took the website down for maintenance, but I was deeply wrong. It turns out that Dark Design Studios, which was the company that made the game, was brought out by Kizaref Studios, an indie developer that was making their own RPG Maker games, and Jake had lied to everyone about selling the game and that it was co-developed by Square Enix and everything. And the later build that was released, there was a bug that made it so you couldn't enter the final dungeon of all things. So I'm like, what the hell? When I found out about this and I looked at Gun Arm Dime's video on it, I was devastated and pissed off beyond words. I made a rant video talking about Jake Jackson and how he could kiss my ass, basically. So yeah, I was upset. I cut off all ties with Jake Jackson. Then I reached out to Kizaref Studios about the sprites, and yeah, I talked to them about it. And because of them, I ended up getting Game Character Hub as well as a few resources to make new sprites. I really like Kizaref Studios and the games that they made. So yeah. What was Dark Design Studios? Well, allow me to tell you about the Jake Jackson incident, ladies and gentlemen. It's a doozy. For those of you who don't know, Dark Design Studios was the creation of Jake Jackson, who was an indie developer at that time who was making a remastered version of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. But it was made on RPG Maker VX Ace hardware, apparently. I was busy looking up assets to use for future sprites, and I came across the pictures and videos of this Mystic Quest remastered game, and it was impressive looking. But I noticed sometime that the original sprites I made were being used in it without my permission, because you could Google some of my concepts and sprites back then. He originally used my sprites in the remake, and I wasn't given and didn't ask permission for it. But after a while, I reached out to him, contacted him, and told him, dude, those are my sprites you're using, and I don't really like that. But after a while, he apologized, and we talked a little bit, and I was okay with it, especially when he made a later build using the updated sprites that I used. And I watched one of my YouTuber pals, Gun Arm Dime, play one of the latest updates, and it was so awesome to watch my sprites in action. My babies were being used in an RPG game, which was so cool. And I wanted to play the game myself to see and move my sprites in action of all things. But sadly, sometime later, I found out that the website was down and there was no way to contact Jake. I wanted to get the game and download it for myself, so I waited a bit. Then the bomb was dropped. Mystic Quest Remastered was nothing but a scam, and my precious sprites, which were used and redone in it, were used for fraud and to scam people out of money. I felt so betrayed and disgusted. I thought the site was down for maintenance, but I was deeply wrong. It turns out Dark Design Studios was brought by Kizaref Studios, another indie developer, and that Jake Jackson had frauded most of the community, and the product was never endorsed by Square Enix in any shape, way, or form. Gun Arm Dime even confirmed this on his YouTube channel, that Jake Jackson had lied to everyone about selling the game and releasing a much better version. In fact, some sprites in the later game that were used were not the ones I originally made and were improved upon. Not bad, but I made way better looking sprites than the ones that were used, and they looked close to the original design and concept, and they were miles better. And the ones that were used were not much better, in my honest opinion, in the later releases, so my work was used for fraud, and I was only credited once in some of the later releases. In fact, I think only one sprite was used, and I'm like, what the heck? Why not use some of my other sprites? because these are much better looking. The later sprites were modified versions of the originals, but the Reuben sprite was the one that was still used. But I was still digress. I was so upset by it, I cut all ties with Jake Jackson, and I reached out to Kizura Studios about the sprites. I had to. I really had to. I later reached out to Kizura Studios about the whole entire incident, especially when I saw Gutarm Dime's video on it, and then I saw their podcast on it because I was pals with one of the creators of the indie developer at that time, and I talked with them for a bit. They were saddened and surprised by my comments, and they were very surprised by the fact that I made such amazing sprites of all things. They did something nice for me in the end when I chatted with them for a bit, and I talked to them about my sprite works and why I made the sprites originally. I did not make the sprites to scam people. They were made for fun because I'm a sprite creator now. I made them for fun. It's what I do now. And because I enjoyed playing Mystic Quest back then, especially because of my sister. So yeah. And in spite of all that, they gave me Game Character Hub, an RPG Maker sprite creation program, and copies of the games, Chronicles of a Dark Lord Episodes 1 and 2. I was amazed by all this, and to tell you the truth, I really didn't feel like I deserved the games when they gifted them to me. In regards to the games, I sadly have yet to do a full playthrough of Chronicles of Dark Lord Episode 1 or Chapter 2 for that matter. Whenever I tried to do a let's play of them, I would put my full attention to them. I should just stop procrastinating and do the LP of the games, but it's hard to stay focused on these things, especially when I have other projects I want to work on, and I'm working at the moment, so my work schedule hinders me from doing videos a lot, which sucks. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. After I finished installing Game Character Hub on Steam, I found it to be a godsend upon startup. Making the sprites was so much more manageable and fun, especially because I had GIMP to edit them later on. There were more options at hand for me, and upon going through all the accessories, clothing, and hair, wings, and everything else, I had fun making future sprites. Hell, I even went back and redid some of my old sprites, and they look 10 times better. I had more freedom, control, and ways to make the sprites better, and the sky was the limit for me. I had been making RPG Maker sprites for about 9 years at that time, and I started out very amateurish, but I improved greatly as time went by. No thanks to Kizura Studios and Game Character Hub. I really do thank them deeply from the bottom of my heart for that. I know they didn't have to do that, but I thank them deeply. Thanks for, thank you guys for everything. And I have enjoyed making RPG Maker, VX, VX Ace, XP, and Loose Leaf, and more recently, RPG Maker MV sprites as time has gone by. Through countless trial and error and experimentation, it has been a godsend, and I've improved so greatly. Some of you have seen some of my sprite works on DeviantArt I've done, and you've even seen some of my concepts and OC sprites I've done on Discord of all things, which is really amazing. And yeah, I can't thank you guys enough for liking, commenting, and faving sprites back then when I did it. On occasion, I did also make faces for characters using the Face Maker option from RPG Maker VX or the other sprite maker that was used originally for RPG Maker VX or VX Ace, and even Face Maker, which I imported into Game Character Hub later on. I haven't touched the face making option in quite a while, but I'm still trying to create stories and scenarios for each of the characters I've made, I'm still making characters to this day. One day, hopefully, I'll put a good scenario and story together for the many warriors, crusaders, knights, and freedom fighters I have made and breathe life into them of all things when I'm not too busy making other fan art sprites of other characters and stuff, One day. Over time, I have enjoyed making all these fantastic RPG Maker sprites. They've become a part of me and the outlet that I have grown accustomed to after all this time. Besides playing video games or watching anime or trying to make YouTube videos, making RPG Maker sprites has become second nature to me. It's gotten complicated, frustrating, ridiculous, and I think at times overbearing, but through it all, I've remained true and stayed true to myself when it came to making these sprites. There were times when I got used for my talents on DeviantArt and from other people, and in return for doing sprites for people back then, I got nothing back in return for my blood, sweat, and usually sleepless nights. I don't even think back then I even got a thank you for some of my hard work, and that was really irritating. In fact, there were a couple of times when I said that I could not do the sprites because at that time, I was working, or how do you expect me to make a 3D sprite when I don't have 3D animation or anything like that? Then I got cussed out right off the bat, and I'm like, well, F you too. If you look at my SpriteWorks and stuff, I don't make 3D sprites, I make 2D works. Seriously, what's wrong with you? And one person even tried to get me to make a sprite out of a stick figure of all things. How in the world do you make a sprite out of a stick figure? How does that work, ladies and gentlemen? How does that work? Because I don't see how in the world that can work. No. I make character sprites such as humans, robots, or androids, whatever, monster sprites with characters having horns, basically, or cat ears, but, how do you make a character sprite out of a stick figure? I asked them, and they said they didn't know. And I told them, your request is denied. Please get off my page. I am not to be taken lightly, and I would not be making a fool out of. So yeah. But I digress. Throughout most of the experimentation and hard times, it's allowed me to improve upon things with my works. I've gone back and redid old sprites, and they look even better now. I'm often seen as an impressive sprite artist through my works. Even now, even though I only do RPG Maker sprites, I've never done other sprites like take a Sonic character sprite, recolor it, give it hair, and, make my own original character, like the Chakra X animation. Change the color, add some hair, change the shoes, and voila! Your own stolen, original, crappy fan character! It was a sexy piece of ass. But I digress. If it wasn't for the original RPG Maker back then, I don't think the seeds of production would have turned me into the person that I am now. And I really got to thank my older sister for that again. She means so much to me. Even though I left DeviantArt back then in late July of last year, and left my page behind that I posted my SpriteWorks on, I still make sprites on occasion for people on Fiverr. So yeah, there's that. I make sprites and faces for people on Fiverr, and even with the current job I have, it's a nice side thing that I like to do. At least with Fiverr, I know my hard work and talent is going towards something, and I can make a little money on the side for what I do. If I ever find another outlet place like DeviantArt to post my SpriteWorks and stuff on, I'd be happy to join. To tell you the truth, I couldn't stay on that website anymore due to spammers, bots, and thoughts who keep trying to get you to join a voice chat or a webcam chat to watch them do a striptease or something. And I'm like, no, I don't want that. So yeah, not to mention people with mental issues on the website, the fact that DeviantArt was being eclipsed, and even fan brats or delusional shippers. Seriously, I hate shippers. And I think it was for the best, even though I lost most of my audience because of that. So yeah, it was probably for the best that I left DeviantArt the way I did. I didn't see myself staying on there anymore because I was working at that time, so yeah. I may have lost my audience on DeviantArt from leaving the way I did on both my accounts and everything, but I have more freedom now to do whatever it is I want, and I don't have to worry about people faving my stuff for no reason or sending me ridiculous requests online for stuff that I cannot do, or they get all uppity when I tell them, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to do this sprite, because I don't have the necessary resources or anything, and then they get all uppity, and they get all blabbermouthy, and they get all pissed off at me for no reason. That's not my fault, thank you. I'm not a tool! So stop it, okay? But I digress. In conclusion, now you know why it is that I started making RPG Maker sprites and why it is I'm a sprite artist. I still make sprite works to this day, you guys. You guys have seen my Game Character Hub sprite videos where I make sprites and everything. My latest was the Powerpuff Girls, and I'm working on the Powerpuff Girls Z sprites. So yeah, you guys have seen my sprite works. Don't you guys like it when I do my little, thing? But yeah, I still make sprites to this day, but I've slowed down just a tiny bit and focused more on helping some people with their projects and working on my own projects at that time. I have some really talented friends from writers, RPG makers, developers, jewelry makers, and content creators, and I support them full-heartedly and everything, I wish them the best in their hobbies and works. If I ever stop making sprites, I think I'll leave a legacy behind, following my name and inspirations toward fellow artists. And if I do stop, then I guess that's it for me. It'd probably be no different if I chose to stop doing YouTube of all things. If I ever chose to stop doing YouTube, then I would just go off into the distance like the lone samurai, and find my own path, Still, I digress. If I've inspired you to become great sprite artists with the sprites that I've done, and you remember me from DeviantArt as Leon Murayami, I want to say thank you. I'm glad I left an impression on you, But yeah, if it wasn't for RPG Maker 1 on PlayStation back then, and my sisters Ebony and Cassandra, I never would have become the sprite artist and person that I am. I tried making a sprite not using the generators, but believe me, that in itself is really difficult because I'm not the best drawer, unfortunately. I can't really draw for beans, unfortunately. So yeah, I stick with sprite making in RPG Maker, VX, VX Ace, Loose Leaf, and XP, and even more so, I started making second story character sprites by making child sprites of certain characters, so that's something cool, I guess. But yeah, will I ever come back to making an RPG Maker game? One day when I've gotten all my ideas, scenarios, and concepts thought out, and everything's been put together with a solid foundation, and it doesn't fall apart like a Jenga tower or a Lego block tower, I'll come back to making a game. Until then, you just gotta believe. And hey, if you want to get into sprite making yourself like what I do, you can do it. You just gotta have patience, sharpness, and a keen sense of artistic design. If I manage to do it, then you can too. I know there are tons of other artists out there who can do better than I can, but hey, I do good myself, I'm doing me. You do you, I'll do me, and we won't do each other, okay? Probably. That's all I can say. So yeah. Thank you guys for watching me talk about my story of how it is I got into RPG making sprite making, basically. So yeah, I'm Leo Hightower, and if I can do it, then you can do it too. No matter what, stay true to yourselves and be fighters. Fighters are people who never quit, and they never stop. They never give up, alright? Until then, stay golden, and peace out.